What makes a book a David Mitchell novel? Critic Daniel Mendelsohn will be here to talk about Mitchell's latest book, Utopia Avenue, and how it fits in to his full body of work. How do you become a player in high-stakes poker? Maria Konnikova will join us to talk about her new book, The Biggest Bluff. Alexander Alter will have an update from the publishing world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's July 10th. I'm Pamela Paul. Daniel Mendelsohn joins us now. He is a professor of humanities at Bard College. He is the editor-at-large of the New York Review of Books. He is the author of many, many books, including most recently Ecstasy and Terror, and the memoir An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic, and a book coming in September, Three Rings, A Tale of Exile, Narrative, and Fate. Daniel, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's great to be here, Pamela. Thank you.
Well, we're not here to talk about any of those things. We're here to talk about David Mitchell. But before we do, just what are your day jobs like in quarantine?
My day jobs? Well, I have to say my existence in quarantine as a writer has not been terribly different from my existence before quarantine. I just sit around reading and writing all day. With the New York Review of Books, obviously, we're doing everything remotely. And this semester, obviously, like everybody else, the second half of the semester, we were teaching via Zoom. So it's a steep learning curve for everybody to get used to, but I think everybody's gotten the hang of it. And, of course, the great question is what the coming semester and autumn is going to be like for everybody. But I have to say, my whole life, all I've wanted to do is stay at home. And so now I get to do that.
Are there any other weird advantages to teaching a college seminar on Zoom?
So much of a small seminar, which is what we have here at Bard, is about the group dynamic. And that's, intangible and pheromonal and, it's reading people's expressions and all of that. It's obviously a challenge on Zoom, but I actually feel that because we started the semester together in the same room, this past semester ended on Zoom, but we sort of got the hang of each other. I don't think there are advantages. I do think you perceive people differently because, of course, when you're looking at a Zoom screen, you're looking at everybody's faces all the time. And in a classroom, you're sort of focusing on the person who's talking, when a student is contributing. So it's a different dynamic. I haven't found it terrible. I mean, I think a lot of people are zoomed out right now, obviously, yes. But, I think it's been a challenge, but I don't think it's seriously affected the quality of the experience, at least from my end.
Well, the particular book that we're going to talk about today and books stems from an assignment that occurred pre-quarantine. And as you know very well, you don't always say yes when we ask you to review something for us. But in the case of David Mitchell's new book, Utopia Avenue, you said yes right away. What was it that appealed to you?
Well, I'm actually a great fan of David Mitchell. I remember when his first book came out, Ghostwritten, I think it was around 1999. And I was just totally blown away by it. And I was by Cloud Atlas, one of his subsequent books, Number 9 Dream. I just thought he was one of the most interesting writers in the English language. And so when you called and asked, I was very eager to do it because I think he's up to some very interesting stuff in his work. As you know from reading the review, I have doubts about the way that his stuff has been going, but I have tremendous respect for him. And I'm always interested in writing about what I think of as a problematic book, a book that has both great strengths and puzzling weaknesses. I think it always makes for more interesting engagement. And because I do really admire him and have admired him in the past, I really jumped at the opportunity. Also because, when you write a big piece about a writer, it's a way of working out for yourself what you think about them. It's in the writing of a long piece of criticism that you figure it out. And I've loved him in the past, and this was a great chance to sort of figure out why.
All right. I want to talk about what you figured out and the sort of the questions you were asking. But first, I want to go to that earlier time when Ghostwritten first came out, because
Mm.
that was one of those books that it was like, it felt like you were in on a secret, like part of a club, reading that book and passing it along to someone else. And, the readers who came on board with Cloud Atlas, you wanted to be like, no, I was there with Ghostwritten. I was there before the movie, okay? What was it that he did in Ghostwritten that was so remarkable?
Cloud Atlas was the one that sort of got the crazy fans on board. But I think, first of all, I think Ghostwritten is one of the most beautiful books. And there was something haunted and haunting about it. It was a remarkably assured first novel. I mean, I can't remember a single misstep in that book. I don't know if you felt this way, but it's this series of interlinked stories that ends up being a kind of daisy chain that at the very end brings you back where it started, and a sort of a character and an element from one story reappears in the next. So it's a kind of chain. So structurally, it was kind of hypnotic. And, his meditations on the way that history connects us over long periods of time I think there's this quality of trying to show the hidden connections between things, among things. You said, Pamela, you felt like you were in on a secret. And I think that's because there's something mysterious about the book itself, that he's showing you how these things that look totally different are in fact connected. And that's very exciting. And he did it so beautifully in terms of the structure.
There have been so many other books like that, and you feel like in many ways they've been copying Ghostwritten. Yeah, Ghostwritten isn't the first book to have done that, but maybe it did it in some more modern way, or it also felt like a global novel in a way. It had that sort of butterfly wings, flapping its wings quality.
Yes. As I say in the review, I think there was something going on in general in the culture just around 2000. There were those movies that were coming out like Syriana or Traffics, even Soderbergh's Traffic, which were also composed of very elaborately interlinked narratives. So I think a sort of, maybe it's a sort of awareness in this country of what maybe the implications of globalization say,
Yes.
that there are these connections swirling, but it was obviously a thing at the time.
It's almost like it was embodying or incorporating the idea of hyperlinks into a novel.
Yes. I think that's a great way to put it. In fact, I wish I'd thought of that myself for the review. Well, when it goes into my next collection, Pamela,
that's right.
You'll get credit.
How would you describe what it is that makes David Mitchell's work distinctive?
There are two elements, I think, that operate in his work. One is a very beautiful realism, a naturalism. His writing is exquisite. I mean, he's a writer of exquisite prose, and his structures are very interesting. And so, on the one hand, there's this very fine grained realism. And then on the other, as we know already in Ghostwritten, because there were supernatural elements in Ghostwritten, ghosts, disembodied beings floating from body to body, but you sort of bought it, you swallowed it because it's so smoothly done. And I would say that one of the really distinctive things about his work is his attempt to entwine the extremely realistic and naturalistic kind of storytelling or subjects with a very, and over time, increasingly extravagant supernatural fantasy element. And as you know from reading the review, I'm not sure that the twining has been all that successful in some of the later novels where I just think it's sort of spinning out of control. But I think he did have it under control in the earlier books, by all means.
To me, the turning point happened with his fifth novel, The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet. Am I pronouncing that correctly? My Dutch is rusty. Let's mispronounce it together. Do you say de Zoet or de Zoet?
It's going to probably end up being like dessert or something, but let's just say dessert. I have no
All right,
idea.
we're going to settle on that. But it felt like, here was this critical darling and everyone was loving it, loving it, loving it. And then we got to the Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet, and there was a kind of divergence among critics. And it didn't feel like readers really caught on to that novel.
I agree with you. This was a historical fiction about a Dutch trader in Japan at the very beginning of the 19th century. And at a certain level, it's sort of a very good, if actually quite conventional, historical novel. He falls in love with a disfigured Japanese midwife, and there's a sort of a melodramatic aspect. And that was, I thought, surprisingly conventional, except for this one strand, which has to do with this demonic cult of child sacrifice, and I thought it was sort of going a little bit off the deep end in that respect. But I remember I read it, I inhaled that book because, as I say, he's a wonderful writer and he's a fabulous storyteller. But I remember a sort of a alarm going off in my head when I got to this supernatural stuff, and I thought, this is starting to feel extraneous. He's sort of just it doesn't really do anything, doesn't do anything for the novel. It's just because he knows how to do it.
Now I feel like we should be saying Jacob de Zoet. Should we go over to Jacob de Zoet?
But we both know that people will be writing in and tweeting at us within minutes. So,
but that figures into this new book as well, Utopia Avenue. Why don't you tell us about the new book? What is this novel?
So Utopia Avenue is like that earlier work of historical fiction. It is essentially a work of historical fiction set in the late 1960s. It starts in the summer of love, 1967, and it's about a rock band called Utopia Avenue that is composed of 4 gifted and incredibly different young British people. And it follows their career. They have a very eclectic sound, but one was a folk singer, one is an R&B guy, one is more of a hard rock guy. And so this sort of element of eclecticism is what defines them. It's a sort of rags to riches story. It's really a kind of a Hollywood novel. They start as unknowns, they achieve stardom, there are temptations, drugs, they're looking to make the perfect album. In that sense, I think it's a very well done historical novel about the 1960s. And there's something sort of swoony in the book about the 60s as a kind of era of authenticity. And he does a very brilliant job of intertwining real figures from that period. There's a rooftop party at the Chelsea Hotel with Janis Joplin, and it's very well done. Then,
do you like that kind of thing?
I think if it's pulled off well, it can be a lot of fun. There's a very funny scene in which David Bowie, still totally unknown, runs into one of the characters on the stairs of their agent. And I think he does it pretty well. Look, this is a genre that, is full of significant novels. The literature of rock is a big genre. You've got Don DeLillo's Great Jones Street, Roddy Doyle's The Commitments, Jonathan Letham's You Don't Love Me Yet. And then there are all the movies. And we know what that looks like, that arc, the humble beginnings, the great apotheosis, the fandom, the drugs, the temptations, and then some kind of crash. Into that, at the very end, and I think none too persuasively, there erupts this loony supernatural stuff at the very end that I could not go there. I just could not go there. It's actually a character from the Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet pops up in this book, a sort of demon from this earlier novel, and wreaks all kind of havoc. And I just thought, what the hell? I just didn't understand why we needed that. And this is, I think, the most extreme example of the failure to integrate these, as it were, 2 sides of Mitchell's personality, this intense, fine-grained realism and this very out there kind of fantasy stuff. I just don't think it did anything for the book. It's just there because he can do it. And that's not a good thing.
It's interesting because now that you're talking, it makes me realize that one thing you're very good at as a critic is always sort of pointing out when the final third of a book goes off the rails. I remember your review of The Goldfinch, the Donna Tartt novel. I think that was also a criticism.
Well, I'm always interested when someone hugely talented goes off the rails. That's interesting. And as I said, for most of this novel, it's very well done and you're into it. And, I think it's a little cliche, but okay, whatever. But I'm always interested in when things sort of veer off because it's interesting to think why people do that. And I think one reason people do that, make these sort of desperate gestures, which is what I think this is because, for most writers, and I'm sure myself included, there comes a point at which you've said what you have to say. And that doesn't mean you're going to stop writing. It just means you're not expanding anymore. And you can handle that in different ways. One way is to be content with doing the thing that you know you can do. And another way is to sort of flail and try to do more extravagant gestures in order to feel that you're still being creative. I don't think there are that many people probably in the history of literature who have managed to keep growing until they drop dead. I think there comes a time when you've done your thing. And I think his thing was done basically after Cloud Atlas.
Is that what you figured out in the process of working on this piece?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because when you get to write a piece like this, you can sort of look at the landscape of a person's career. I mean, I think Mitchell is pretty much my age. He's probably in his mid 50s, so I'm a little older, but you get to look at the landscape of an author's career and you can start to see the topography of it, which you cannot do when you're in the middle. Like you could not do when Cloud Atlas came out because it was his second book or third book, whatever. And that I always appreciate because it's a way for me to understand what's going on. And in this case, I mean, it's a point I make with regret because I admire him so much. I just don't think there's any link between this sort of wacky supernatural ending and the rest of the book, except that he can do it. There are fans who like it because it's all about connecting one book to the other, but I just don't find it persuasive.
Which of his books is your favorite?
Ghostwritten is still my favorite. I loved Cloud Atlas, which I remember reading on a transatlantic flight, and I was like a crack addict. I could not, people kept walking by offering me, drinks or whatever, and I just said, go away. It was just mesmerizing and brilliantly constructed. But I still think Ghostwritten is my favorite, and I think it's because of the quality that you mentioned, this sense of a secret, that you're being let in on a secret, and this sense of revelation that is achieved through the beauty of how he connects these different stories. I've liked some of the other ones by all means. I actually liked Black Swan Green, the sort of coming of age story, which seems to be autobiographical. When I reread it to write the review, I was again struck by how totally successful I thought it was.
I'm struck by the perfect match between setting and book with your reading Cloud Atlas on a transatlantic flight. Like you planned that out, All right. I want to end on a different note, which is many people know of you as a very literary person, a great book critic and writer, but they don't know that you are also a true expert, I think, a great authority on television. And all of the great series that I've watched really come from your recommendation. So at this time where people are watching many TV shows and binging on things, I have to ask, what is your current series recommendation?
Well, I just finished watching season 2 of Dead to Me with Christina Applegate, which I totally loved. Have you seen it?
No.
Oh my gosh, Pamela,
No, I only
you have
follow
to see
your
it.
recommendations, Daniel.
Well, I'm giving you one.
Okay.
You have to do it. It's so great. Really, really great. And then I just saw, because Stephen King was tweeting about it, this thing called Devs, a science fiction thing, which I thought started out well, but sort of fell apart.
Well, we'll leave everyone with a recommendation for Ghost Written, for Cloud Atlas, for Black Swan Green, and Dead to Me. Daniel, thank you so much for being here.
Great to talk to you, Pamela. Thank you.
Daniel Mendelsohn reviews Utopia Avenue and looks at all of David Mitchell's work in this week's book review. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Maria Konnikova joins us from Brooklyn. Her latest book is called The Biggest Bluff: How I Learned to Pay Attention, Master Myself, and Win. Maria, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on, Pamela.
So I think you were last here for about 4 years ago for your previous book, The Confidence Game. Very different situation because by here, I mean you were in the studio in our headquarters in New York City. Now you're home in Brooklyn and I am in my closet. How's your pandemic going?
You know what? All things considered, I feel incredibly lucky. We have an apartment, we have food, and I'm able to do a lot from home. As a writer, there's a lot that I already have set up. So, and I don't have kids, and I know how difficult it is for people with children right now, how much their lives have been disrupted. So, all things considered, doing very well. How about you?
Well, I wish I could give that exact answer. It's been a little bit busy. I do have kids, but I also don't have a new book out like you do. Like, what has this been like? Was your pub date moved or did it stay stable?
My pub date stayed stable, and who knows if it was the right decision or not. You can't really predict these things, which is one of the themes of the book. So I guess, ironically, it really hits home because one of the themes is you really can't predict what's going to happen. You don't know what cards are still to come. But it was going to be June 23rd, and it came out on June 23rd. And that was originally intended to be in the middle of the World Series of Poker. So actually next week, I was going to be in Las Vegas playing in the main event of the World Series of Poker. And obviously live poker is no longer a thing. And all tournaments were canceled. So it's a very, very different landscape from the one that we'd envisioned. My tour went virtual. A lot of events just got canceled. And it also feels a little bit strange. There's so many important things happening in the world that I feel very sheepish saying, hey guys, I have a book out. I'd like to promote it too.
Right. Yes. It's an awkward moment, but people still need to read. And I imagine people still maybe need or want to play poker, which is in part the subject of your book. I want to know what that event is like. And is it the Las Vegas event? Is that virtual now? How is that going?
It's not happening. So usually the World Series of Poker takes place over a month and a half in Las Vegas, and people come from all over the world. It's the single largest poker event. And the main event, which is the $10,000 buy-in, is considered just the epitome of poker greatness. If you win that title, you get to call yourself world champion of poker for 1 year. And originally my book was actually supposed to be a year of me playing, ending with this event 2 years ago. And obviously that's not what ended up happening. And that didn't end up being the book, but that was the original plan because of the prestige. It's kind of like the Wimbledon of the poker world. And so now instead they've decided to move some of the events online, but it's very different.
Why didn't the book end with the World Series of Poker as originally intended?
Well, my original timeline was supposed to be a year. So I had never played poker at all, ever. I didn't know anything about the game, didn't know how many cards were in a deck. I mean, just completely ignorant about this world. And so the idea was that I was going to get someone wonderful to coach me. It ended up being Eric Seidel, who's considered one of the greatest players of all time. And I was going to work with him for a year, and the book was going to culminate in this major event. Things don't often go as planned. And it turns out that poker is pretty hard, and it took me much longer to start playing. And so The first time I walked into a casino and sat down at my first ever poker table was in January of 2017. And the main event is at the end of June, early July. And so you don't have to be good at math. I mean, my last math class was in high school, but you don't have to be good at math to realize that that's not a year, that that's actually much less. So it took me much longer to gear up and to get started. And so that main event became 6 months into the future and not actually a year. And if you think it's difficult to learn a skill in a year of a very complicated game, 6 months is just asking for defeat. And I was quite stupid and decided I was going to play anyway. It did not turn out well, but it also was very obvious to me that there was no book yet. I hadn't played enough. I hadn't learned enough. I wasn't going to be able to write the book that I wanted to write. And so I made the decision, and luckily I had an editor who fully supported it, to keep going and to say, okay, it didn't really work out the way I had planned, so let's just jettison my book proposal and keep going and see what happens.
Were you having fun? Did you enjoy playing poker?
I did. Not at the beginning, because at the beginning I was both losing a lot of money, finding everything very overwhelming, and at the lowest stakes, poker is not necessarily the most welcoming world for women. So I was experiencing a lot of negativity, a lot of sexism. It wasn't particularly pleasant. But the more I learned about the game, the more I discovered how fascinating it was and how good it was at teaching me the skills that I'd been wanting to learn forever, how to teach me better decision making, how to teach me to be better in control of my emotions. It taught me a lot about myself, about the kind of person I am, the kind of person I can be, and it gave me the skills to reach for that person. And as I started discovering that, I started falling in love with the game. It definitely helped that my coach, Eric Seidel, really loves the game. And I think he was able to transmit some of that passion to me very early on. And of course, it helped that eventually I started winning. So after 2 months, when I won my first baby tournament, I think it was a $60 buy-in, something like that, then I said, oh, this is great. I like poker.
Were you like a good game player naturally? I sometimes think that the world is divided into people who really like games and enjoy them and pick them up easily, and then people like me who see just the rule book for Settlers of Catan and sort of just leave the room, or just tune out the way I tune out when someone tries to explain finance. Were you someone who loved playing games?
Pamela, excuse my laughing fit, especially with Catan. I'm you. I am you. And you should talk to my niece and nephew as they try to run after me to play Settlers of Catan with me. And I try to hide and pretend that I'm not there. No, I'm not a games player. I don't like playing games. And I mean, I start getting just... right now, just thinking about the possibility that I might have to play Settlers of Catan at some point is giving me great trepidation. So no, it's funny. Almost everyone in the poker world, everyone who's successful was a games player, was someone who played games growing up, was someone who loved games, loved thinking that way, whether it was chess or backgammon or Catan, probably. Magic the Gathering, that's huge. Poker players are games players. And so I really didn't fit in from that perspective. We didn't really have any games. I don't think we had a card deck, and we certainly didn't really have any board games growing up because my mom, I think I inherited the I hate board games gene from her. She couldn't stand it. And so I read books. That's kind of what we did as a family. And it's very funny to me that not only did I end up studying and loving a game, but that I was able to use it in a way that I never thought possible. I mean, had somebody told me that this was going to happen, I would have just absolutely laughed. Plus, I hate casinos.
So why did you want to do this? Why this, of all things, would you say, you know what, this is the book I'm going to write. I'm going to write about poker, which takes place in a casino, which I do not like, and as a game, which I do not like.
Originally, it wasn't going to be about this at all. I wanted to write a book about luck, about the role that luck plays in our lives. I wanted to try to figure out, how do we tell the difference between where skill ends, where our control ends, and where chance begins? And I'd had a lot of setbacks in my own personal life that made me really realize how much we take for granted when we're lucky, and how much of our life outcomes are determined by luck and by pure chance. And I needed a way in. whenever I'm starting a new book, I did this for The Confidence Game, my last book. I did it for Mastermind, my first book. I do it for newspaper articles. I read a lot. I just try to immerse myself in the questions that I'm thinking about because you never know what direction you're going to go in. And in my reading about chance, I came across the seminal text of game theory, The Theory of Games, and learned that one of its authors and one of the fathers of game theory, John von Neumann, was a poker player, and that poker was actually the foundation of game theory. And there was a quote in von Neumann that really resonated with me, and that made me think, wow, maybe I should look into this poker thing. He wrote, real life consists of bluffing, of little tactics of deception, of trying to figure out, what does this man think I mean to do? And that is what games are about in my theory. And I read that and I thought, this is fascinating. This is interesting. And it definitely helped that von Neumann wasn't a games player. I could identify with him. He said, I don't like games. I don't like chess. I don't like Go. I don't like all of these other things. I don't like roulette. And the reason he didn't like them was because he didn't think that they could help with strategic decision making in a real life setting. Chess, he thought, was very interesting from a mathematical standpoint, but at the end of the day, it was a mathematical problem. It could be solved with computing power. Roulette, he just thought wasn't interesting at all because it was just pure chance, pure gambling. Poker was how humans made decisions, those little tactics of deception, a game of incomplete information where there's hidden stuff that I don't know, but that you know, and there's stuff that I know that you don't know. And we need to try to figure out who knows what and how do we make the best decision possible, knowing that we don't know everything and knowing that we don't know what cards are still to come. So I started reading about poker. And I decided, you know what? If it was good enough for von Neumann, it's good enough for me. Let me try to do this.
Your previous book, as you've mentioned, was called The Confidence Game, about con artists. This book is about poker. It's called The Biggest Bluff. I mean, what's the difference between conning someone and bluffing?
That's a very good question. Conning someone is using their trust against them for your own ends. And those ends aren't the ends that you're representing. And they're usually pretty nefarious. You have malicious intent. And so when I was talking about the confidence game a lot, people would ask me, well, what's the difference between someone in sales and a con artist, or a lawyer and a con artist, and are non-politicians con artists? And I would say no, because there's a difference between persuading someone, misrepresenting something a little bit, exemplifying more confidence than you feel about something in order to attain something that everyone knows about. Your intentions are pure. You think this is a good thing, versus using it to deceive, using it to take advantage of people, using it in a way that is furthering yourself, but not in a manner that you're actually communicating to anyone. And bluffing is not malicious. Everyone knows they're playing a game. Everyone knows that people are trying to misrepresent their cards. And bluffing is not so much about lying as it is about projecting confidence and creating an image of yourself as stronger than you actually are. And I think that that's a skill that we use in interviews, in negotiations. People use it all the time. And if they don't, they're probably not going to get the job, and they're probably not going to win the negotiation. They're probably not going to be as successful. So I think it's that malicious intent, and whether people are on board with the fact that, yeah, you're going to be misrepresenting things a little bit or not.
Okay, you've admitted to not being a math person, but you do have a PhD in psychology. And given what you're saying here, it seems like that would really help with your poker playing. Were there advantages to having that background?
I definitely think so. I think it let me ramp up much faster than I otherwise would, because I was able to leverage the skills that I'd picked up over years and years of doing research, not just in psychology, but I studied specifically the psychology of risky decision-making under uncertain conditions, under hot, emotional, stressful conditions. I studied self-control. My advisor was Walter Mischel, who's known as the marshmallow guy, the man who created the marshmallow studies of self-control. Does the child wait for the marshmallow or not? And how does that predict how this child's life is going to turn out? So I think the fact that I had this theoretical background, that I knew in theory about a lot of these biases, about a lot of the tactics that we could use to fight them, I think it helped me have a greater awareness in game. It helped me have the vocabulary, the right language to figure out what was going on, to identify it, and to then be able to work on it. I think this is a point that I make in the book, but I think it's really important that we have precise language for things. I quote W.H. Auden somewhere in the book. There's this wonderful interview that he gave many, many years ago for Time magazine. And he says, language is the mother, not the handmaiden of thought. And I had that language with me from psychology.
All right. Well, speaking of language, the game that became sort of your game is called No Limit Texas Hold'em, which I have to say, like, just the name alone is terrifying to me. How did you get to that game? What is that game? Why that?
There are lots of variants of poker. No Limit Texas Hold'em, or just No Limit as people call it, is the most widespread these days. It wasn't always, but the main event is decided by this particular variant. Von Neumann played this particular variant, and I think that had something to do with the reason I chose it. But so why did von Neumann choose No Limit Hold'em? He looked at a lot of different poker variants, and he decided that Hold'em, let's ignore the no limit part for a second. I'll go back to that. That Hold'em held the best balance of known to unknown information in order to model strategic decision making in life. So in Hold'em, you have 2 hole cards, and the hole cards are your private cards. Those are the cards that only you see and nobody else sees. And then there will be 5 community cards. And the community cards are face up, so everyone sees them. And he said, okay, this is actually perfect because there's just enough unknown and just enough known that it's something that can approximate what is realistic in a real life setting about the incomplete information. Other variants of poker, sometimes there's only 1 whole card, so only 1 private card. And then it becomes much more like chess because so many variables are seen by everyone that it becomes much more mathematical. Sometimes, on the other hand, there are more whole cards. Sometimes you'll have 5 cards, for instance, that are face down that only you see. And that becomes much more of a chance-based endeavor because it becomes much more difficult to make those sorts of calculations, and there becomes more gamble to the game. And so he said, No Limit Hold'em is actually the best thing to do if you're studying human decision making. The no limit part means that you can bet it all at any given point, and life is no limit. You can always bet everything. You can bet all your money. You can bet your life. You can give away your heart. You can always do anything that you want to do. There's really nothing constraining you. And so having another variant that limits it would be a bad way to go if you're trying to mimic human decision making.
Okay, I'm just going to kind of fit into the language that you're using here. And this is a sort of Oprah-like question, but did poker bring out the best in you? Do you feel like it brought out a good side to you?
Yes. It's so funny because a lot of people say, oh, poker, evil, casinos, gambling. And I think it's made me a much better person. It's made me much more aware of my weaknesses, and I've been able to start working on them psychologically, not just as a decision maker. So I found out, for instance, that I'd internalized a lot of gender stereotypes. Because poker is 97% male, a lot of that comes out. I mean, everything at some point is going to come out at the poker table because you're making decisions under very stressful conditions. You're thinking strategically, you're making very hard choices for hours and hours and hours, and you get tired. When you get tired, all of your hangups come out. And so I found out that a lot of times I'd make bad decisions because I didn't want conflict. I didn't want confrontation. I wanted people to like me. I wanted to just play nice. And that's not the way to win at poker. And that probably made me make a lot of bad decisions in life. So that's from a decision-making standpoint. But it also made me much more aware of my emotions. There's a concept in poker that I think everyone needs to use in life that's called tilt. And tilt means letting emotions into your decision process. And I realized I used to think that I'm someone who's pretty well in control of my emotions. I studied self-control. This is what I do. I know this. Poker made me realize that no, I actually have triggers. There are things that make me angry. There are things that make me lash out. There are things that make me do this and that. And poker forced me to actually be self-aware in a way that nothing else really has to that extent, and to fix it. And so I think in my everyday situations, in my everyday interactions, I became much better able to kind of calm myself, keep cool, and not get into conflicts and situations that I didn't need to get into just because I was being very emotional. So I think that it was very useful in that regard. I can go on. I actually think that it's such a wonderful tool of both teaching people to think and also empowering people to be stronger versions of themselves.
Okay, now you've done such a strong sell on poker, and given that people are mainly still quarantined to some extent, and people might be interested in trying this thing out, like, is poker still fun remotely?
Yes, it's very different, and I far prefer the live version, but there are hybrid versions. I mean, I'm sure that everyone is absolutely sick of Zoom, but there's a way to, you can play with your friends and have Zoom cameras so that you can see one another. So there are definitely ways to do it remotely in a way that's fun. I will say, though, that you have to be very careful. And if you're playing with friends, just play in a friend home game, because in a lot of states, including New York, online poker is still illegal.
Ooh, so you can't play right now.
No, but I'm going to New Jersey next week because
All
it's
right.
legal in New Jersey.
Well, have fun in New Jersey, Maria. It's always a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
It was an absolute pleasure, Pamela. Thank you for having me. And I hope this makes you more open-minded to the idea that poker might actually be a game that is an exception to your otherwise game disliking nature, because it is for me.
I may stick to chess, but the book again is called The Biggest Bluff: How I Learned to Pay Attention, Master Myself, and Win by Maria Konnikova. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela. I bet you can guess what I'm going to be talking about this week. It's something we've been talking about for the past few weeks.
Some books that are selling.
Exactly. The books that are selling, if you look at the bestseller list, including our own, and particularly this week on Amazon, you'll get a sense of what readers are interested in these days. And they are still interested in all things Trump. The top 2 books on Amazon on Thursday were ones that we've been discussing quite a bit recently. Number 1 is Mary Trump's book, Too Much and Never Enough, and she is Donald Trump's niece. The second is The Room Where It Happened, John Bolton's book. Both of those books are published by Simon & Schuster. Both of them were targeted by either the Trump family or the Trump administration in an effort to prevent them from being released, which, failed in the John Bolton case. In the Mary Trump case, they have actually moved up publication, I think, for that very reason, to try to speed things up. And the book is now coming out next Tuesday. It was supposed to come out on July 28th. But there's still a hearing on Friday, which is the day that this podcast is going to air. And I don't know exactly how things are going to go, but it looks very likely that any effort to prevent publication is at this point unlikely. I mean, all the information's come out. The copies have leaked. We've had our own review by our excellent Jennifer Salai, and we've had Maggie Haberman and Alan Foyer sort of digging into the content of the book. And I think, part of the strategy there on the publisher's part is to say, look, this information's out there. Any effort to contain it is sort of futile at this point.
What's interesting, too, is that, we're talking about books selling. So books are selling.
Books are selling quite well. I mean, this is really quite remarkable considering the economic environment that we're in, the fact that a lot of brick and mortar bookstores remain closed, or they're sort of doing curbside pickup or limited things. Consumers are wary of going out in the middle of a pandemic and leafing through books the way they might have once done. But the latest figures from NPD BookScan, which tracks print sales, showed that print unit sales in the United States were actually up 2% year to date this year compared to last year,
wow,
which is really quite astonishing. So, yeah, if you're Simon & Schuster or another publisher with a newsmaking book right now, you're pretty happy. I think the numbers maybe gloss over the fact that for lesser known authors, debut authors, authors who are writing about a nonfiction subject that isn't related to Donald Trump or to something else that's driving the news cycle, those books might be suffering and slipping through the cracks because those authors really do rely heavily on independent booksellers to prop them up and hand sell and get people excited about them and start word of mouth campaigns.
Although one thing that it seems is doing well are sort of book clubs and online readings and online events for authors. It feels like that's been pretty lively.
That has been lively, and I think that's another silver lining that publishers really weren't expecting. One, major source of marketing for them and a way to sort of make an author's name is to have book tours and signings and events and ways that authors can connect with audiences. And of course, those were all canceled due to the pandemic and have not been going on. But the virtual events, and that, these are often hosted by independent stores. Politics and Prose has had a very robust kind of calendar of, I think, almost daily virtual events with authors, have drawn pretty big crowds. And, when you do something like that, you can get maybe a couple thousand people from around the world instead of 50 people who happen to live in that town. I think one question is, and I've heard different things from different booksellers, is whether that translates into sales, because I think there's something about going to a live event. Sometimes they bundle a ticket with, a copy of the book, for example. You're sort of encouraged, and you're encouraged when you're there to buy a copy of the book, get it signed. Maybe if you sign on to a Zoom meeting, you don't feel that urgency or sense of connection to purchase a book right then, although maybe you'll get interested and purchase it later.
Well, I have one little data point, and I can't speak for other authors, but I have a speaking event this week that is happening via Zoom that was supposed to be in person at a library. And what they did was purchase the books ahead of time, send me book plates to sign. The book plates I then sent back. And then somehow or another, I don't quite know how, everyone who goes to the Zoom will get that signed copy. So it feels like maybe where there's a will, there's a way. I don't know. I don't know if that's happening, if that's widespread.
I think that is very clever. And if it's not widespread yet, now that you've brought it up on the podcast, it will certainly become more widespread. Yes.
For the sake of other authors.
Exactly. Authors and independent stores, which are struggling right now and are so dependent on in-person events. I think, if more virtual events can lead to an increase in sales, everyone will be better off from that.
All right. Well, we like that. Alexandra, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Greg Coles and John Williams. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
Let's start with you, Greg. What have you been reading since we last gathered here?
I'm getting into a little bit of a Shakespeare mood, and the reason is there's a book that's coming out very soon, like this week or next week, that's got a lot of buzz by an Irish writer named Maggie O'Farrell called Hamnet, which is kind of a biographical look at Shakespeare's life, and especially his wife and his son Hamnet, who died young. But that's not what I'm reading right now. In preparation for that book, which I will read soon, I'm reading a book that came out earlier this year by James Shapiro called Shakespeare in a Divided America. Shapiro is very well known as a Shakespeare scholar and a professor at Columbia University. And he's written some earlier books for a general audience about Shakespeare, partly about the authorship question, and then a look at 1 year in Shakespeare's life, 1599. This book is something a little bit different for him. It's looking at the reception of Shakespeare in America, starting in the colonial era. In the Puritan days, he was kind of, all theater was frowned on, and Shakespeare was banned shockingly long, I think, in Massachusetts until well after independence. The premise of the book is that he goes through political divides in America, and looks at how those divides have informed the public's reception and reading of Shakespeare for very specific plays at very specific times. So it opens with a chapter on miscegenation, looking at how Othello was received back in the antebellum period. There's a chapter on manifest destiny, and he looks at a woman who played Romeo back in the 1800s, an American woman who played Romeo in London, when tensions were ramping up about America's westward expansion, and so the decision to open on a London stage with this role. And so on. And it goes even into Shakespeare in Love, looking at the changes that were made to Tom Stoppard's script for that. It really becomes a look at how personal ideology and your position in the culture and the cultural debates of the time inform your reading of any text. I mean, he does it through Shakespeare because that's what he knows and because it's fascinating. It becomes kind of an argument for Shakespeare's greatness that he can contain all these different viewpoints, and that what you see in him depends very much on what you bring to him. And it becomes like a Harold Bloom exercise in Shakespeare as the secular Bible, where of course you can do that with the Bible too. What you bring to it affects your reading of it and what you draw from it. And so he never uses the term negative capability, which is Keats's famous phrase for describing Shakespeare. But it runs throughout, where negative capability is what Keats said is the ability of art to kind of contain all ideas at once, to not land on any one position, to make room for philosophical ambiguity, political uncertainty in favor of artistic integrity. And that's what I'm taking away from this book so far, is it's very much like a case study in negative capability and how it plays out in the reception of any play at any time.
He had a couple of books, I think, in between this and a previous book that he edited for the Library of America called Shakespeare in America. This new book is called Shakespeare in a Divided America. And that book was a collection of pieces looking at, similarly, the reception of Shakespeare in America from 1776 to the present day. And it had, Washington Irving and Poe and Emerson and Twain and Whitman.
Mary McCarthy did a piece called General Macbeth, I think. But he talks about this a little bit in his introduction to this book.
Yeah, I was going to ask, does he explicitly tie these together? Did editing that anthology for the Library of America inspire this new book where he wanted to kind of exert his own view on it?
Library of America approached him to do that anthology, and he had not previously been aware of how he just hadn't kind of paid attention to how Shakespeare had been received in America. And gathering the pieces for that got him thinking about these themes and looking at the different ways that different audiences have approached Shakespeare or have responded to Shakespeare. And so that set him on the path to this book. John, what have you been reading?
I've turned into a different creature in lockdown, I think, because I've been reading 5 or 6 books that I think I'm going to finish, which is rare for me. I usually, if I'm juggling that many things, it's because I'm not really inspired by any of them. But they're all fairly short, which I think is one of the reasons I'm doing it. And the one that I'm going to talk about this week is James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, which a lot of people have been talking about for not just the past couple of months in America, but also since Ta-Nehisi Coates, I think, sort of modeled his book Between the World and Me after part of this book. So The Fire Next Time is actually composed of 2 pieces written in 1962 and 63. Neither one of them is called that. One is called My Dungeon Shook, Letter to My Nephew on the 100th Anniversary of the Emancipation. And that's a very short, 9 or 10 page piece that was the model for Ta-Nehisi Coates sort of addressing.
Right, the letter to his son.
And then the second longer, but still not very long piece is called Down at the Cross, Letter from a Region in My Mind, which was published, I think, in its entirety in the New Yorker originally, and which I'm pretty sure I read many, many moons ago. But as Pamela and I discussed with Tina on a recent podcast, I often don't retain much. So it's as if I'm reading for the first time, because that might have been 25 years ago at this point. Since this is James Baldwin and I don't think he needs much of an introduction, I'm going to read one passage that really resonated because of the current moment, I think for obvious reasons. And this is where he's in Harlem. This is from the second piece, the longer piece, and he's talking about his own sort of education and enlightenment about things and his opinions about race relations in America. And at one moment, he's in Harlem listening to a Nation of Islam speaker, and he starts here. I have long had a very definite tendency to tune out the moment I come anywhere near either a pulpit or a soapbox. What these men were saying about white people I had often heard before, and I dismissed the Nation of Islam's demand for a separate black economy in America, which I had also heard before, as willful and even mischievous nonsense. Then 2 things caused me to begin to listen to the speeches, and one was the behavior of the police. After all, I had seen men dragged from their platforms on this very corner for saying less virulent things, and I had seen many crowds dispersed by policemen, with clubs or on horseback, but the policemen were doing nothing now. Obviously, this was not because they had become more human, but because they were under orders, and because they were afraid. And indeed, they were, and I was delighted to see it. There they stood in 2s and 3s and 4s, in their Cub Scout uniforms and with their Cub Scout faces, totally unprepared, as is the way with American he-men, for anything that could not be settled with a club, or a fist, or a gun. I might have pitied them if I had not found myself in their hands so often, and discovered, through ugly experience, what they were like when they held the power, and what they were like when you held the power.
John, one of the things I wonder often, I feel like I can see lines between the reviews that you edit by our critics, Dwight, Pearl, and Jen, and you're their editor, and your own reading. And you recently edited a review by Jen Salai of this new book by Eddie Glaude. That book is called Begin Again, and it's about James Baldwin. And so I wonder, was your reading of Baldwin inspired by editing Jen's review?
You know, in this case, it wasn't that direct just because of the moment we're in and people are talking so much about canonical texts by African-American authors. And so I think it was more because of that I came to it. But there's no question that I often, because of the critics, will find myself reading, if not what they're reviewing, which I often do, things that are tangentially related to it. I think Pearl reviewed a Library of America collection of books by Jean Stafford not too long ago. And that's what sort of inspired me to finally start reading her, which I'd been meaning to for a really long time. So that kind of thing happens a lot, which is one of the many perks of my job, is that I have these very smart people inspiring what I investigate and read.
Well, that's one of the perks of my job, because I actually have a collection. I think it's of 3 Jean Stafford novels, and it has the one that you talked about on the podcast in it. Isn't it about a bear?
The Mountain Lion.
The Mountain Lion. Okay.
That's a great book.
Large carnivorous animal.
Scary animals. Pamela, what are you reading this week?
Well, a book I recently read doesn't have any scary animals, although there are some scary people in it. It's called Save Me the Plums by Ruth Reichel. The subtitle is My Gourmet Memoir, and it came out a few years ago. And I remember I had a friend at the time who was just starting at Condé Nast, where Ruth Reichel was the editor of Gourmet magazine. And so I sort of slipped her a galley, which she devoured, because in large part, it's a kind of tell-all about Condé Nast culture. And in this case, in the 2000s and the aughts, which I guess was the last sort of final heyday of Condé Nast. And that company, of course, has been in the headlines a lot recently, much turmoil going on there. I picked up this book before the most recent turmoil, but against the backdrop of, sort of disintegrating print magazine economy and culture. And I guess the continuity with what I've read recently was probably the closest comparison was Claire Tomalin's memoir, which I also read recently, about working as a book critic in the sort of heyday of British literary magazines. So this was sort of part of that trajectory. But it's interesting to read about a bygone era, comparing it to a current era that is now itself bygone, because Ruth did not write this against the sort of most recent upheaval at Condé Nast, but against just sort of the general economic distress of the company and the rise of the internet, which, again, now feels like very old news. The book itself is really enjoyable. It's one of those books also that was a little bit inside baseball around our own day job, because Reichel was the restaurant critic for the Times before she went over to Condé Nast. So this book is a lot about how you go from being a kind of newsroom employee at a place like the New York Times to becoming an editor-in-chief at a Condé Nast magazine, and going from, very different, let's say, workplace cultures and principles. At the New York Times, as you all know, I mean, we can get free books, but beyond that, we have all kinds of rules and regulations around what we can and cannot do, things that just don't exist at Condé Nast, where you can and do get huge bouquets of flowers and a clothing allowance. And, there's discussion over getting seated at the right table at the Four Seasons. She is reprimanded at one point by her colleague at the time, David Remnick, who was the editor of The New Yorker, for flying in coach, because you cannot, as a Condé Nast editor, sort of be seen with the riffraff.
Oh my God.
You need to be in first class. Oh, yeah. It's one of those things where you read it and you think, like, not only is that really unlike my job, but you can never get that job again, because that job just no longer exists. That world is gone. The world of, sort of bottomless expense accounts. And of course, the world goes away for Ruth Reichl, because this memoir is about the death of Gourmet, which was, killed by Cy Newhouse. And it was Bon Appetit, which became this remaining house food magazine. That magazine, of course, has been in the headlines very recently because its own editor-in-chief was ousted for different reasons. So there's lots of turmoil. It's interesting to me, too, to enter into the food world, the food journalism world in particular, which, I don't know, maybe it's cattier than the book journalism world. I think it may be.
Does this book fairly thoroughly cover her time as a critic at the Times, or has she written about that elsewhere?
She's written, this is like her third memoir, isn't it?
Yeah. This does not cover her time at the Times, just the tail end of it. But it's fun in that you see former colleagues. You're like, oh, hi, Trish Hall. There you are, having a different job. She was a former colleague of ours at the Times. So it's fun to kind of visit that earlier New York Times era as well.
So it does get into kind of the closing of Gourmet and her ouster there. What is she doing now? Does she just write memoirs, or does she have another career?
No, I think she's a full-time writer, and she's written novels as well. I think her most well-known memoirs are Tender at the Bone and Comfort Me with Apples, neither of which I've read. This is the first book I've read by her. And I think she's also written a cookbook, at least one. So I think that's what she's doing now.
I follow her on Twitter, and she doesn't tweet a lot, or it doesn't pop up in my stream a lot, but it's a very enjoyable Twitter stream, partly because it's so removed from kind of the world of Twitter and instant reactions. It's always like, sitting on the hammock with a loaf of bread now.
I was wondering, because like the idea of like an enjoyable, Twitter account, like an oxymoron right now, but good to hear that
I'm going to go follow her right now.
There are some. That's right. All right. Let's run down the titles once more of what you all read.
I'm reading Shakespeare in a Divided America by James Shapiro.
I'm reading The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin.
And I read Save Me the Plums by Ruth Reichl. All right. Bye, guys.
Bye, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.